All right. So welcome to our final summit of the 2020 school year. Certainly not our final summit of the year, because we'll be hosting these all through the summer as well. But I'm really excited about the topic that we have today. And I suppose I should introduce myself here in just a moment. But there we go. Of course, as with any of the Human Restoration Project resources, none of this would be possible without our Patreon supporters. So you all are the people who help us keep the website going, who help us keep releasing those resources, and help us move into the next level as we get nonprofit status, release our micro-credentialing platform, all of that stuff. So as with or unlike, I should say, a lot of resources which are just one directional, participation is key. So for at least while other people are talking, let practice good digital etiquette here. Mute your mics if you can, and let us know in the chat if you want to participate or have something to say, or just raise a hand or something and go ahead. So who am I? I'm Nick Covington. I'm the creative director of the Human Restoration Project, and I am a history teacher in Ankeny, Iowa, and we've currently been on, our crisis learning model since March 12th. So it's been kind of an awkward end to an otherwise pretty stellar school year. So when we were thinking about topics that we could discuss to kind of, get us through to the next stage of summer learning and preparing for the next school year, we were thinking about three key questions here. The first one just being, delete. What about this new reality should we leave behind? And why should we do that? All right. What should we recycle? What would we like to see carried forward into the 2021 school year and beyond? And then crowdsource. All right. Let's put our heads together here, all 15 of us, and let's see if it's possible to make these systems and strategies work better. How can we humanize crisis learning going forward should we need to turn it on in the fall? And how can we get there together to make this better for all of us? So I think in terms of starting with that first question, I'll just go ahead and kind of give you my thoughts on what I was thinking, and then I'll let everyone else chime in after that. So please, if I end up talking for most of this time, I will have failed. So hopefully, you've given these questions some thought, or you're thinking about them and can chime in as we go. So when I was thinking about this first question, what about that new reality would we leave behind? I was thinking about all of those 80s and 90s movies, when I was a kid growing up, that had that last day of school trope, which showed all of the kids throwing their books and papers and everything out the window, rushing out of school, leaving things a total disaster because they couldn't wait to leave school behind. And kind of thinking about that now through a progressive lens, saying, well, what does that really say about the way that students viewed school? But we're going to participate in a little bit of this right now. Like, what are we going to throw out the window? What are we going to, burn in the burn barrel at the end of the day in terms of what we would leave behind? And my biggest one that I would like to leave behind is a big one. I would like for us to move as far away from the College Board as possible. And I know if you followed me on Twitter at all at Covington AHS, you know that's been a thorn in my side for several months as they have announced the postponement of SATs, as ACTs have been canceled, as International Baccalaureate has canceled their exams and their classes and things like that. The College Board decided that AP testing should just proceed as usual. So that caused a lot of stress for me and my students. And we had a voluntary learning environment. It was not a required learning environment. We didn't have any kind of school for about the first 3 weeks. We didn't have any kind of distance learning, crisis learning in place. And so just to pick that up then at the end of March and the beginning of April and say, nope, AP tests are still on. it was really stressful for me. It was really stressful for students. I had one student who didn't make it through that his exam, and he is going to have to be part of the retake cohort at the beginning of June to do another round of at-home online crisis testing because his exam did not submit successfully. So I know about 8% of the total exam takers fell into that window. And students, about 20% of my students that I surveyed afterwards said that they rated it a 1, their testing experience a 1 out of 5. Not just the technical aspects of it, but the stress, lots of crying and tears and frustration involved in it. And it's not anything I'd like to see replicated into the future. So if we can use this as an opportunity to leave the College Board behind, I think that would definitely be for the better. So yeah, that would be on the top of my delete list. Let's get going with some of you. Feel free to unmute your mic or your video, and you can get going in that as well.
Hi, my name is Greg Mansenix. My wife and I are here, and we both work for the same district. And we were thinking the restrictions that the district placed upon us, and in talking to other teachers who worked in other districts as well, it seemed like some of those restrictions were just, it seemed completely random. And, one district saying you had to use this platform, another district saying, no, you absolutely cannot use that platform. You have to use this platform. And for teachers and for students and parents, having as many options as possible open to us, that was something that we were very frustrated by, is the idea that, every district seemed to just, and I understand that we were kind of making this up as we go, but kind of the number of restrictions on teachers to actually kind of administer what they needed to do and how to do it most effectively for their students, that was a big frustration for us.
I was going to chime in too. So in our district, we were told we were not supposed to do live sessions with students. I teach first grade, and they're not just going to go off and do it on their own. So I needed to do live sessions with them. So I did, and we were told not to. But like all the restrictions put down upon us were pretty ridiculous.
Hi, my name is Robert. I teach at an independent school, actually, in the DC area, and I'm an AP US Government and AP US History teacher. So that College Board has been my nemesis these last couple of weeks, and my students, by the way. When you're thinking about standardized tests and what the College Board does and what happens at district levels with district tests, I think we can narrow that down a little bit too, and think about just the function that tests, like the traditional tests, play in schools. As we've been talking as a school about, what are students going to do to demonstrate what they know in the distance learning model. A lot of colleagues said, well, I can't really give a test because they're doing it at home, and what does that look like? And it's open book, and it's not really a test, particularly math teachers, science as well. And it's caused us to look at tests a little bit differently. And maybe that's something else that we can leave behind too. The traditional sit for 45 minutes and do these math problems at your seat and turn it in and get a grade. Maybe we can leave that sort of model behind as well.
Totally agree with you. I'm Julia. I teach at Evergreen Middle School in Colorado. Testing is one of my big deletes as well. Testing in the traditional sense, that is. I love the idea of demonstrations of learning where kids design their own platforms to launch their learning into the world. Definitely that relates across the board to everything everyone's been saying. So totally on board with you. I think there's exciting opportunities for that. I'm sorry to hear that there are some districts who did limit actual one-on-one face-to-face connections. I mean, that makes me sad. I think the relationships that we have with our kids are number one, and we're teaching them, we're modeling for them how to brave new worlds, how to make sense of what's going on around them. And if we take away that face-to-face and instead create the canned assessment and testing and make our focus on that, we're creating a mentality of product education rather than the human right that education is for everyone.
Hi, this is Skylar Prim from Highmark Environmental Charter School, a small public charter in Wisconsin. And I think that I would agree with everything that everyone has said. And I would just say, like, standardization in all its forms, I think, is what I would like to delete. Thinking about like these one size fits all rules for, you know, what you can and can't do for students during virtual learning have clearly not served their needs. I know that for my students, I've had to employ every method of communication I can think of to make sure that I'm remaining in contact with them, just based on where they are, what their preferences are, what their comfort level is, and what, you know, what's going on in their lives. And so I think that having those arbitrary restrictions, like, I understand there need to be some privacy restrictions and legal restrictions and those sorts of things, but you know, I think that just expecting every student to fit into the same box and every teacher to fit into the same box is something I would very much like to see deleted.
While we wait for some other people to start to think about that first question and what we would delete, I put this in the chat, and maybe you'd seen it here, but it just seems to be really interesting, whether it's from Kate or, you know, from Julie and Robert as well, that those things that get in the way of connecting with students as learners and as humans seem to be the things that we resent the most in this crisis learning period. So, like, it's really interesting that the system thrives on that standardization in the normal world, right? Ranking and sorting students, irrespective perhaps of their home experiences or trauma. And now that we've put those things, those experiences, and perhaps those traumas at the forefront, we realize how much of a gate they put in between students and our learners, whether it's AP testing in the middle of a crisis, right? Where you don't know what students' home lives have been like for the last 2 months, or what their testing environment is going to be like, or their access to technology, or whether it's face-to-face meetings with students. Now, I think, you know, the pendulum kind of swings both ways on that. And I think I'll have some more things to add to that when we get to the recycle portion. But it's just really interesting to see that those are the common themes in what we would like to see deleted from that crisis learning environment. So I'm so stoked that we have so many people participating in both the chat and in the conversation. So keep those things going. What else are we thinking we want to leave behind?
I'll go. I'm Linda from Ohio, and I feel like we leave behind the whole concept of teaching the whole child, you know, and so we've left behind a lot of like the social emotional, and we're just trying to kind of reconnect that with our practice in education. And I would like to see more of that. It's difficult to do in a digital sense, and I feel like the focus has been, at least in our district, more academic rather than, you know, the true trauma, kind of like what you were saying, Nick. Same thing.
Hi, everybody. I'm Dina from Delaware. One of the, you know, aside from testing, which everybody else has mentioned, there's, I feel, a distinct lack of flexibility with what happens in a lot of the classrooms. I see that a lot in my own building. And a lot of it's done out of what is in the best interest of the teacher, but not necessarily the student. And I would really like to see more flexibility. And I think that as more teachers in my own building have become more comfortable with how technology can serve a multitude of purposes, there is more opportunity for us to be flexible with students in their learning as we, you know, integrate back into the next school year, whatever that's going to look like. I know a lot of schools have discussed out having to start off the school year still doing some form of remote learning, but I think that it offers us the opportunity to embrace that. And as we start, you know, if we're able to get rid of testing, it allows for more time for us to, you know, to be flexible. So it's definitely something I would like to see have happen.
I'll pipe in again just to throw another shout out to what you just said, Dina. I totally agree. I mean, everyone, buzzwords, student voice, student voice, student voice. And then technology jumps in and we need to evolve what that looks like. And it's huge. We get to honor the voices who've been left out, like Linda just said. We need to raise up the voices that are speaking about the inequities that are going on, not just teachers and students, but entire school districts that just haven't been able to access their students to give them their voice. There's just this opportunity to really to raise up everyone's voices in a way that collectively creates a system of collaboration as we redefine what's next. I mean, take this Google Meet right now, right? When I'm in a Google Meet with my kids or I'm in a Zoom with my kids, it's awkward. It's like, there's this like artificial level of who's going to talk next and how's it going to happen and how do we have a conversation through cyberspace. And we all need to get to adjust to that. We get to learn how to communicate in a different way. And then when we go back in the fall, I think we're literally going to have to relearn how to communicate with each other face to face, 6 feet apart, mind you, but like there's just so much to this entire experience that gets to be unpacked, and we get to use it to evolve teaching and learning everywhere. Everyone right now, if you look, like the chat's going nutty cuckoo. That's how it works in my class too. Like everyone's typing their answers. It's just, there's this whole new way of communicating, and we get to look to it as a growth source and a way to engage each other differently. Like I will say in my Zooms or my Google Meets, oh my gosh, Sky Carpenter, that was a phenomenal point. Would you mind giving your voice to that? Will you say that out loud? Because there's something to the difference between typing it in a chat and actually speaking the words out to ask someone to respond. It's so powerful.
Just to jump in on the topic of technology a little bit, I sort of agree with the sentiment, that, well, obviously we need to learn to use new technological tools to connect with our students and give them voice and all that. And we're iterating, we're learning how to do that as we go. And I think there are some exciting ways that kids who wouldn't necessarily thrive in the sitting around the tables or at desks in the classroom, raise your hand discussion kind of format that can emerge in, through screens and chat rooms and things like that. I've seen that happen. It's pretty neat. I've also observed, though, schools and districts, I'm talking as a parent here too, the new technological tool of the week, and I get what's happening. We're trying to figure it out. We're trying to deal with all kinds of problems about access and connectivity and all that. But, back in March when we were looking at all of this, some sort of online teaching gurus would share tips. And one that I kept coming back to was simplicity, simplicity, simplicity. Go with one tool that works for as many students as you can and stick with that tool. So there are lots of different ways to connect with kids with technology. But I'm seeing the chat here, app overload. Yeah. Like when you get a new thing every week, or you throw a new format or a new way of, sharing work at kids, it's going to turn them off and create lots of barriers too. So I hope we land on what works and stick with it.
I really appreciate what you're saying about sticking with it and keeping things simple. There's definitely an obsession with adding something new every year, throwing out all these projects, and just like throwing teachers and students and learning under the bus in the process. I think that if I want to think about what I would leave behind, it would be this obsession with racing to the top and being so competitive. I would like to see in this new system a way that we honor the people within it, so that we are focusing on transformation and relationship rather than purely the numbers.
There's been, just based on what you're just saying, there's been a distinct backlash of, and initially when we started this process, there was a lot of, praise to teachers for picking things up and kind of moving forward and, doing the best that we can. And there's been a distinct backlash over the last 3 to 4 weeks of, teachers not doing enough, or teachers giving too much, or and it goes for my students, it goes week to week. Some of my kids are having a great week one week, and then the following week they're not. And that's not really anybody's fault. It is what it is. And we're all dealing with something we've never dealt with before. And it's upsetting. It's so upsetting because like, I know I'm working my butt off, and I know a lot of other people are as well, to try and offer some level of support. And we've never done this before. Like, nobody's done this. So the idea that people have now gone into attack mode is really upsetting for me. And, I want to be able to support, my students and my colleagues as best I can. It's hard to do that when you feel like you have to be defensive about, what you're trying to do and what support you're trying to offer. So that's been something that I've been trying to battle with. And this whole idea of feeling like no matter what you do, it's not going to be good enough, and it's like, and it definitely makes me more empathetic for my students and what their experiences are. But that's been something that I've been struggling with lately. And it's been upsetting to a certain degree with me.
I agree with that too. I feel like it's been a very interesting transition in terms of it's almost like you're teaching the student and then the student's whole family who is behind the curtain, like outside of the video screen, and so everything you're doing is right there in the spotlight. And I think a lot of this piece of what I've been doing is helping to educate the parent and the family of how learning, in my opinion, should be, where the student is really grappling with something and trying to figure out something, as opposed to, the methodology and traditional way that many parents have been taught in school, which is, memorize the stuff, then regurgitate it back, then get an A on the test, and then move on to the next concept. The way I teach is more project-based, and it's, where students are really grappling with the concept and they're working through things in sort of a productive struggle kind of way. And so then to set that expectation management for the families and to help the families to understand that philosophy and the importance and value in doing things that way has been an interesting, unique sort of piece of this whole thing too.
Yeah, that's been super powerful for me too, Linda. Like, some of my students actually taught their parents how to use Google Classroom. Their parents were elementary educators and they didn't know how to use it. They taught their parents how to use Zoom. Really, though, I think it comes down to both a delete and a recycle here. At least for my kids, I've always taught them how to be their own teachers. Like, what space are you setting up in your home to make sure that you are creating health and well-being, balance with screen time? What do you know you need to be successful as you look at this screen and you try to ingest what it is that the learning opportunity? Like, how can you communicate with your parents about what it is you're supposed to do? So we're leaving behind, or we're deleting that traditional teacher role, that sage on the stage, that anything other than teacher as facilitator of the learning opportunity. And each kid is then able to personalize their own learning, like find their own purpose in what it is the assignment is creating for them. It's a personalized learning experience where each kid gets to take personalized action on behalf of their own learning, not just objective, but their own learning vision, their mission for what they want in the world in terms of who they are as a learner in the world.
And Julia, I think that this crisis moment highlights that so much more than it ever has, because I think it's frustrating to see some of the response of educators on social media in the wake of all of this, right? Complain about student engagement, and when we practice one model that is exactly that sage on the stage for 6 months out of the year, and then expect the last 3 months to be self-guided, we set ourselves up for that kind of frustration. So I think that is a perfect exact point where if we had students in a more self-directed mindset in the first place, we wouldn't be up against engagement hurdles, right? We could just transition into that facilitation role and set up students for new and exciting things that they can set off and do on their own in a new home learning environment, but the crisis happens when we try to make that switch and then translate all of those structures of school into the home life, right? And so then you see kids in front of Zoom for 8 hours a day, or you see them, you see them having to, I don't know, submit two graded assignments a week, trying to replicate those normal structures. So I don't know if this would be a good point to translate, because Julie, you kind of made the transition for us here into that recycle question. That second question, what would you like to see carried forward into 2021? And again, I love that I can just give my 2 cents and then turn it over to excited and engaged educators. So it's kind of been a dual response in this crisis moment, hasn't it? So we've seen on the one hand sort of that clamp down, right, of teachers who, now that they don't have, or systems, now that they don't have control, they have to try and wrench that back, right? And so that is more mandatory synchronous learning. That is more assignments in the grade book. It's grade book management. But on the flip side of that, right, we've also seen a lot of grace and a change in expectations and putting social emotional learning first, and a lot of grace in terms of grading policies, and standardized assessments. For as much grief as we give them, right? States canceled their exams. Or many states canceled their exams. And so I can't imagine that there's students heading into the fall that are going to be at a disadvantage because they didn't have 3 days of testing, in the spring. We're just going to have to work to meet students where they're at. So I think if I was going to recycle something and see it carried forward into fall and into next year, I would think it would be that grace, right? We can't go back to grading like we used to have it. We can't go back to standardized assessments like we used to have them. And so, yeah, I would be curious then, as much as we would like to see things left behind in this crisis learning environment, what do we need to bring forward? What's going to make our lives and our students' lives and our communities' lives more enriched because we practice them?
Yeah. Of course, we're in the same reality without examinations, but to use a word that has been used already, we too have an observation with ranking, and to substitute for exams, we find ourselves in an extraordinary situation in that we're going to get more ranking rather than less. And this is because teachers will be asked not to submit their students to exam boards, but to literally rank each and every student in order in their classes, essentially from, for example, 1 to 30. So ranking has been amplified without examinations. That's an interesting reality in the UK today. And I wonder whether the absence of exams can be taken to mean a kind of a loosening of the hold of a culture of testing, assessment, and so on. If I might sort of change the subject slightly in terms of what I will get rid of, my own particular point of view is I would be interested in discussing getting rid of the concept of the school as a building. What we've seen in response to the need for social distancing, not just in the UK, but in other countries and especially in Denmark, is a realization that outside the walls of buildings constitutes an environment that can keep, at least in the short term, young people safe. So I wonder, as somebody with a geography background, an outdoor education background, and a practice background of working in the street as an educator, whether we might have the opportunity now to make the case for a broader concept of outdoor learning, not as something that's an extracurricular activity, but something that's at the heart of education per se.
I know Skylar's got some experience with that.
I love that, Graham.
Go ahead. Yeah.
So I love that, Graham. I totally agree and thank you, Nick. We're transforming the common school experience. It's no longer based in the building. It's not the school. It's a learning experience. So, for example, in my district, who's already laid out our fall restart plan, there's potential that we would have 25% of our kids come in 4 days a week. So 25% on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. What if, as we teach kids to become their own teachers and we are facilitators, what if we teach them how to create learning experiences out in the community? Hey, here's how you could do this at a bookstore. Hey, here's how you could do this and rope in some science requirements going on a hike. Oh, and wait, that actually connects with PE too. What can you create? What can you co-create as a student to show, to demonstrate the learning that you need to make that doesn't have to exist inside an actual classroom? We get to help kids own their learning in a new way that steps right outside the brick and mortar. It gets to be a community learning experience that isn't just kids with paper and pencil in a seat.
Oh, go ahead.
Just a quick response. In the UK, many people have been dusting off their aged copies of Ivan Illich's Deschooling Society. And I have a declaration to make that I'm not a school teacher, I'm a community educator. And of course, we've lived by these kinds of ideas for generations now. So we suddenly find an interest in our practices. And I would say this, that I take from my own teaching of the future generations of community educators, that one of the most interesting provocations that I've ever been able to offer to school teachers is to ask the question, if the walls of your classroom fell down, would you teach differently? And of course, without too much reflection, pretty much all teachers would realise they would have to, because then it becomes like the street. Young people could, in effect, simply walk away. So we learn something really quite peculiar about the distinction between the intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. Perhaps that's enough there to move on a bit.
All right. Yeah. When we build our classroom outside of those mortal walls and think about that, that's one thing that I really would like to keep. No matter where we go back, it's sort of opened a window for me when I realized how the absence of in-person class has opened up the presence of the ability to connect with people more globally and connect students to experts in a different sort of way. So during this whole thing, I've had the opportunity to have some guest speakers come in and talk to my class about different ideas that I would have never thought to do before and never sought to do before. And so I think it's such a big shift in the way we think about how we're going to approach this. But I also think, I don't know how we're going to get it's going to be an interesting shift for some people that teach more traditionally, in terms of that.
Great point, Linda. One thing that I was thinking about when all of this started, and I think I might have sent out a sarcastic tweet about it, was just what exactly does teach like a champion look like in this new digital distance learning environment? Like I can imagine what a more humanized, flexible environment that is more responsive to students or lets them take initiative on this as well. But I can't imagine the kind of crisis that you would have gone through as an educator had you lived your life as the sage on the stage and cold called students as a form of engagement, right? I don't know what that looks like on a webcam. So I can't imagine that those kinds of pedagogies survive into the next fall or into the following school year without intruding onto students' home lives, without intruding into students and parents. Yes, jumping on the table doesn't have the same effect when I'm all alone. It just scares your dog, Skylar. So, man, that's all I could think of when we're talking about that, is how can we use this as an opportunity to not just reimagine instruction, right, in this space, but how do we, to Graham's point, teach with the walls knocked down and reimagine school as a whole to just, enrich that experience and make it work for everybody. Absolutely.
Nick, I think you've probably said something to this effect before, but I think one of the main things is, we're supposed to be preparing students for what's ahead, and we're supposed to be thinking way ahead and preparing them for what's ahead. And if we're expecting that students are going to be in compliance mode that doesn't match a single skill set that's necessary for 10, 15, and 20 years from now. And it's a little unnerving for me that, people are still wanting to do, they want to default what's comfortable to them, but not necessarily what's going to prepare students for what's ahead. And one of the huge skill sets necessary and needed is the creativity, but how are students allowed to become comfortable with that? It's through trial and error, and a lot of what we've done hasn't really prepared them to be comfortable with that. It's prepared them to comply, but we don't need compliance. We need students who can think creatively and be very responsive to what's happening. So it's going to be interesting to see how this time period allows students to then become more creative and grow.
I would make an observation from my conversations with young people at this time, conversations that I've had having worked on the street and, of course, talked to young people over garden walls when at this time when they're not in school. And one of the things that's been quite fascinating is to hear that they have felt, I'm making a connection to Deanna's comment about how time works. They say that they're much more in control of their educational time. So some say they start later. Some say they take longer to do the work that they're given because they like it that way. Gives them a chance to think a bit more. This is a long-standing interest of mine, studying how time works in education. And of course, the school is symbolically, its time is delineated quite literally in many places by a bell and lessons of a certain time. And in the UK, we've got this wonderful language of age-related expectations. And as a governor of a school, in conversation with school teachers, I say to teachers, what are your problems? And they say, we've got so many children who are not meeting their age-related expectations. And without any sense that I'm talking with irony, I suggest, well, why don't we give them another 6 months? And then everybody says, oh, well, that would do it. There's no sense of an irony that some young people might take more time, might need more time, and be in control of time. And I think this new kind of crisis reality, it's teaching us something about time. So I look to a more what I would call temporally appreciative education, in which we might negotiate a bit more about how time works. If young people are interested, perhaps they could take more time. If they're less interested, that perhaps they could shift their attentions and interests, as Dewey might say, to other places. But the sense that time is always clock time in school. It's never the time of experience, which is, of course, one of the things that we get from learning outside. Time seems to work differently, the sense that experience matters in outdoor learning. So I think there's some interesting things there also that might inform an interesting future.
Wow, I can't not pipe in for that one. That was beautiful. I totally agree with you. Let's quantify time differently, right? We're going for it here. We get to recycle whatever we want. Let's help kids transform the way they experience learning. It's not about your BTUs, your butt time units in your seat. It's not about your, oh my gosh, the bell rings at 2:50, I'm out of here. It's about what is the personalized amount of time you need to be able to learn what you need for you. It's change the way you experience each moment outside of the box, outside of the 8 to 3 or that traditional schedule that so many schools have tried to keep in place. The move from synchronous learning to asynchronous learning is powerful. And you're right, it's all founded in that time construct that we've all been adhering to, and now totally just went right in our faces. Because my days now are so much different than my days at school, and all of my kids say the same. That was a phenomenal point. Thank you for making that.
Yeah, ditto. Thank you, Graham. The concept of the due date, for example, is just flown out the window, right? And I have students who are in crisis mode or sick or family members sick or just, unable to get out of bed for a couple days, whatever it might be. And they need more time to do something. And there are other students who need to work and put their focus on whatever the project they're working on. And, they read 6 books in a week and write a paper or do a presentation that's well beyond the requirements. And they just say like, sorry, I just really got into it, and they complete it early. So it's been really interesting. I think we need to think more about that. But students are showing me that time doesn't mean the same thing it used to, that they have needs of time that are just different. And sometimes it inspires them to work faster or more diligently. And other times they just need a little bit more, and then they get back on track and they're good. So great points about time.
And I think it's interesting that some of the students, going back to earlier, we were discussing having some grace. It was interesting to see that some of the students who thrived in a traditional setting perhaps didn't do so well when we took away some of these time expectations and things like that. And they actually needed a little bit of guidance. They needed a little bit of support, and they wanted me to set some guidelines for them and say, well, if I just said, well, turn it in when you're done, they weren't okay with that. So it was interesting. Some of the lessons that we ended up teaching, especially at the elementary level, is, okay, well, how do you go about this when the teacher's not there face to face every day to kind of give you that guidance? And then some of those very students who maybe struggled in the classroom, they absolutely thrived and excelled in this kind of new format. So I think, where we were lending support, that was definitely a big growth opportunity for me to kind of see, some of the students that I was used to just being on point all the time, I had to kind of go in and again, but it was the same kind of grace that we were talking about. Is I know they were very frustrated with themselves, and almost, I think, frustrated with me that I wasn't giving them these clear deadlines and things like that. So those kind of growth opportunities for everybody were very exciting to see over this time.
And I think that's what's interesting is that grace and that flexibility that we would normally, I think in a lot of contexts, provide for students in the classroom, sometimes in that digital environment then becomes that one size fits all. But again, to your point there, if you open it up and you allow for that flexibility in the digital space, I mean, that maybe even opens up opportunities for collaboration and work that just can't happen in the 45 minutes that you might have with students, or in the 8 to 3:30 that you might have with them. So it opens up their day, to kind of bring it back to Graham's point about time, for them to be their most productive and their most creative and their most collaborative when it best serves them. Just like as adults, we have to struggle with and I don't mean struggle like in a negative way, but we have to figure it out for ourselves how life works for us, right? Are we morning people? Are we evening people? Does this work best fit us and the way that we want to live our lives? Or do we need to, change our routines and change our job and change our living conditions, so that way we can better be aligned with how we see ourselves. So in the digital space, there's a lot more opportunity for that, but we don't use it for that a lot of the time. So I wanted to transition just because we were set up for about an hour conversation, and we're hitting these last 10 minutes. Although at the rate this is going, we can certainly go over, and perhaps people can drop off if they need to leave right at 11. But let's start to crowdsource this, and I don't mean just necessarily resources or websites, although that is certainly part of this, right? Bring your knowledge and expertise to this. What articles or what books, are going to be good summer reading for us? What organizations outside of the Human Restoration Project should we connect to or partner with to make this a reality for our students heading into the fall? How do we connect? And recognizing part of that reality is convincing administrators. It's convincing superintendents what the right thing is for students and for communities, and not necessarily just what is the most convenient thing. So is it possible to make these systems and strategies work? How do we get there together? And again, just to sort of start for myself and speak for me before I turn the table over to you. I've been fortunate enough that, just given my history in the district and the roles I've had in the past, I'm part of our Return to Learn committee, which will be the committee meeting weekly between now and what we're assuming is going to be the start of the 2021 school year. And we're going to be talking about that transition every week with a representative team of people within the district. And I think that there's probably an arm of that has a student and parent, stakeholder group that's part of it as well. But I would use this if you're an educator or a parent and you have, some connections in there. This would be the time to try and get on some of those committees to advocate for students, or if you're on a PTO, or if school board members. This can't just be the time to kind of retreat into our own classroom space. It's interesting to use that phrase now, classroom space, because that's my desk. This you have in your community, to use this time to bend that arc towards students, right? And how to humanize this learning. So how can we benefit now from your expertise, your processes, your resources? What do you have to help us crowdsource the future together? And I can catch up on the chat now too. You're good, Kate.
Okay.
We gotcha.
So I was a teacher in the UK. I now train teachers and volunteer educators. But in 2010, we developed something that we called a learning skills curriculum. And we had one full day a week. It was broken into 2 half days where we did these project-based learning experiences, and the students worked collaboratively. And we taught them all of those invisible processes of learning that you're talking about today. All the self-regulation stuff, how to manage their emotions, how to get themselves into the optimal zone for learning, how to forgive themselves when they were struggling to do that. All of those kinds of things, we gave them space to do that. And it ran for 3 years. And when we do GCSEs in this country at 16, the grades had gone up. And what was really interesting for us was that we have something called the disadvantage gap, which I'm sure you have in the States as well. And it closed significantly. So without holding back the top students, the students who had always been held back by just life, just by the difficulties that they have in their life, they had an opportunity to catch up. And this happened because they were teaching one another, they were learning from one another, and they were talking about how learning happens. How come you're so good at learning this? How come you can do this and I can't? And just having those natural conversations enabled them to teach each other their tricks. And so learning wasn't something magical that only clever people could do. It was something learnable. And we did that, and we carved out the space. So I don't know whether you would have an opportunity to do something like this when you go back in the fall.
I had a quick supplementary to that. I put it in the chat. I've had interesting conversations again over garden walls with parents who've got 2 or 3, sometimes even more children at home, and they're now cast in the role of home educator. And some of them have told me wonderful stories about how they've done precisely that. They've encouraged older older children to teach the younger ones, sometimes the other way around. And as a community educator, by our definition, our work is absolutely against any kind of age segregation. Often we're trying to work intergenerationally as well. And it always has amazed me that we separate kids into such narrow age bands in school. And projects that I've been involved in collaboration with teachers, where we've taken older pupils, and especially the ones who are struggling, and encourage them to teach younger ones, simply to consolidate the fact that they have learned things, even when they don't believe they've heard things. That's really quite fascinating to me. So these kind of collaborative learning cultures, they really, really have to be at the heart of future learning experiences, both informal and in informal settings.
And a lot of it is around the questioning. So instead of testing children on what did you learn about X, you ask the bigger question, which is what did you learn about yourself? What did you learn about learning while you were learning about X? So someone described it as a split screen. So you have what you're learning and how you're learning running as parallel processes that you give an equal amount of time to. And I really liked that metaphor, so I stole it and I'm sharing it with you.
Yeah, my heart is just in my throat right now, because that is exactly the kind of language I think, that just needs to be standard in the classroom, right? Not standardize the content and not standardize the process, but right, let's at least just put in those structures to support students in thinking about their own learning. Oh my gosh, that might, yeah, I'm going to pocket that for later use, Kate. Thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome.
I love it too. Huge shout out. And what if we actually model that for our kids? Instead of being oh my gosh, let's do this new way for the kids, let's model it. Let's put ourselves out there. Let's just say, look, teachers are having to reinvent how we do everything. Come get on board with us. Help us think through our own thinking. So powerful, so powerful. I would love to ask Kate if you're willing to share any resources you have that we could all just dig into or absorb in any way possible. I'll just say it like that. I love it. It's totally the next evolution of learning, period. Invisible learning processes.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll put the links to the websites on here, and we're going to do a webinar, I think in the next week or so, with a basic framework for creating these kinds of shared learning experiences, so that it's just without having to change everything that you do, you can just add this lens to how you're already teaching, so that it makes all of the processes of learning something that you talk about.
All right. Now, I think because we have...
Yes, awesome. Transparency.
Sorry, Julia. Okay.
No, go Nick. Sorry. I think my delay. Go for it.
Okay. Well, I was just going to start to close some things up, since we're since we might be losing people, but I wanted to just take the opportunity before people have to go for other obligations to say that this doesn't have to be the last time this conversation happens, especially with this group of people. Which with these summits, it's hard to tell what the attendance rate is going to be. And I would love, to Linda's point, maybe have a redo of this maybe in the next month or so, and maybe plan for some breakout sessions so we get the chance to share. But before we lose folks and kind of go back into the ether of social media or something, share some contact information if you feel like dropping Twitter handles. If you want to drop some websites in there, Kate shared Rethinking Ed. Those will show up as hot links on there as well, so that way you can get those open and bookmarked. And I think what I will do is that after the chat, I can go ahead and put together a list of those websites as well and tweet them out when we get the video up there too. So again, recall that this is going to be for more than just the audience here. We're going to get a lot more viewers and listeners when we put this up as a YouTube video and a podcast. So think about not just things that you would want to share with us, but things that you would want to share with a broader audience. So I will leave a closing thought to anyone else out there. But in lieu of that, thanks for joining us. Go ahead and navigate to thehumanrestorationproject.org. Follow us at HumResPro. Follow me at Covington AHS. This has just been an amazing conversation. So does anyone else want to have a last word before we close things out? All right. Well, this was great, and I hope you all have a good rest of the day, good rest of the week, and thanks again for spending a chunk of your day with us here. So have a good one, everybody.